Wage slavery refers to a situation where a person's livelihood depends on wages or a salary, especially when the dependence is total and immediate. It is a pejorative term used to draw an analogy between slavery and wage labor by focusing on similarities between owning and renting a person. The term wage slavery has been used to criticize exploitation of labor and social stratification, with the former seen primarily as unequal bargaining power between labor and capital, and the latter as a lack of workers' self-management, fulfilling job choices, and leisure in an economy. The criticism of social stratification covers a wider range of employment choices bound by the pressures of a hierarchical society to perform otherwise unfulfilling work that deprives humans of their species character, not only under threat of starvation or poverty, but also of social stigma and status diminution. Similarities between wage labor and slavery were noted as early as Cicero in ancient Rome. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, thinkers such as Proudhon and Marx elaborated the comparison between wage labor and slavery in the context of a critique of societal property not intended for active personal use, while Luddites emphasized the dehumanization brought about by machines. Before the American Civil War, Southern defenders of African American slavery invoked the concept of wage slavery to favorably compare the condition of their slaves to workers in the North. The United States abolished slavery after the Civil War, but labor union activists found the metaphor useful. According to Lawrence Glickman, in the Gilded Age, references abounded in the labor press, and it is hard to find a speech by a labor leader without the phrase. The introduction of wage labor in 18th century Britain was met with resistance, giving rise to the principles of syndicalism. Historically, some labor organizations and individual social activists have espoused workers' self-management or worker cooperatives as possible alternatives to wage labor. History. The view that working for wages is akin to slavery dates back to the ancient world. In 1763, the French journalist Simon Linguet published a description of wage slavery. The slave was precious to his master because of the money he had cost him. They were worth at least as much as they could be sold for in the market. It is the impossibility of living by any other means that compels our farm laborers to till the soil whose fruits they will not eat, and our masons to construct buildings in which they will not live. It is want that compels them to go down on their knees to the rich man in order to get from him permission to enrich him. What effective gain has the suppression of slavery brought him? He is free, you say. Ah, that is his misfortune. These men have the most terrible, the most imperious of masters, that is, need. They must therefore find someone to hire them, or die of hunger. Is that to be free? The view that wage work has substantial similarities with chattel slavery was actively put forward in the late 18th and 19th centuries by defenders of chattel slavery, and by opponents of capitalism. Some defenders of slavery, mainly from the southern slave states, argued that northern workers were free but in name, the slaves of endless toil, and that their slaves were better off. This contention has been partly corroborated by some modern studies that indicate slaves' material conditions in the 19th century were better than what was typically available to free urban laborers at the time. In this period, Henry David Thoreau wrote that it is hard to have a southern overseer, it is worse to have a northern one, but worst of all when you are the slave driver of yourself. Some abolitionists in the United States regarded the analogy as spurious. They believed that wage workers were neither wronged nor oppressed. Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans argued that the condition of wage workers was different from slavery, as laborers were likely to have the opportunity to work for themselves in the future, achieving self-employment. The abolitionist and former slave Frederick Douglass initially declared, "Now I am my own master," upon taking a paying job, but later in life, he concluded to the contrary. Experience demonstrates that there may be a slavery of wages only a little less galling and crushing in its effects than chattel slavery, and that this slavery of wages must go down with the other. Douglas went on to speak about these conditions as arising from the unequal bargaining power between the ownership, capitalist class and the non-ownership, labourer class within a compulsory monetary market. No more crafty and effective device for defrauding the southern labourers could be adopted than the one that substitutes orders upon shopkeepers for currency in payment of wages. It has the merit of a show of honesty, while it puts the labourer completely at the mercy of the landowner and the shopkeeper. Self-employment became less common as the artisan tradition slowly disappeared in the later part of the 19th century. In 1869, the New York Times described the system of wage labor as a system of slavery as absolute if not as degrading as that which lately prevailed at the South. E.P. Thompson notes that for British workers at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries, the gap in status between a servant, a hired wage laborer subject to the orders and discipline of the master, and an artisan, who might come and go as he pleased, was wide enough for men to shed blood rather than allow themselves to be pushed from one side to the other. And, in the value system of the community, those who resisted degradation were in the right. A member of the Builders' Union in the 1830s argued that the trade unions will not only strike for less work and more wages, but will ultimately abolish wages, become their own masters and work for each other. Labor and capital will no longer be separate but will be indissolubly joined together in the hands of workmen and workwomen. This perspective inspired the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union of 1834, which had the twofold purpose of syndicalist unions, the protection of the workers under the existing system, and the formation of the nuclei of the future society, when the unions take over the whole industry of the country. Research has shown, summarizes William Lazanick, that the free-born Englishmen of the 18th century, even those who, by force of circumstance, had to submit to agricultural wage labor, tenaciously resisted entry into the capitalist workshop. The use of the term wage slave by labor organizations may originate from the labor protests of the Lowell Mill Girls in 1836. The imagery of wage slavery was widely used by labor organizations during the mid-19th century to object to the lack of workers' self-management. However, it was gradually replaced by the more neutral term, wage work, towards the end of the 19th century, as labor organizations shifted their focus to raising wages. Karl Marx described capitalist society as infringing on individual autonomy, by basing it on a materialistic and commodified concept of the body and its liberty. According to Friedrich Engels, the slave is sold once and for all. The proletarian must sell himself daily and hourly. The individual slave, property of one master, is assured in existence, however miserable it may be, because of the master's interest. The individual proletarian, property as it were of the entire bourgeois class which buys his labor only when someone has need of it, has no secure existence. Similarities of wage work with slavery. Critics of wage work have drawn several similarities between wage work and slavery. Since the chattel slave is property, his value to an owner is in some ways higher than that of a worker who may quit, be fired or replaced. The chattel slave's owner has made a greater investment in terms of the money he paid for the slave. For this reason, in times of recession, chattel slaves could not be fired like wage laborers. A wage slave could also be harmed at no cost. American chattel slaves in the 19th century had improved their standard of living from the 18th century and, according to historians Fogel and Engerman, plantation records show that slaves worked less. were better fed and whipped only occasionally, their material conditions in the 19th century being better than what was typically available to free, urban laborers at the time. This was partially due to slave psychological strategies under an economic system different from capitalist wage slavery. According to Mark Michael Smith of the Economic History Society, although intrusive and oppressive, paternalism, the way masters employed it, and the methods slaves used to manipulate it, rendered slaveholders' attempts to institute capitalistic work regimens on the plantation ineffective and so allowed slaves to carve out a degree of autonomy. Unlike a chattel slave, a wage laborer can choose between employers, but they usually constitute a minority of owners in the population for which the wage laborer must work. While attempts to implement workers' control on employers' businesses may be met with violence or other unpleasant consequences, the wage laborer's starkest choice is to work for an employer or face poverty or starvation. If a chattel slave refuses to work, a number of punishments are also available, from beatings to food deprivation, although economically rational slave owners practice positive reinforcement to achieve best results and before losing their investment by killing an expensive slave. Historically, the range of occupations and status positions held by chattel slaves has been nearly as broad as that held by free persons, indicating some similarities between chattel slavery and wage slavery as well. Wage slavery, like chattel slavery, does not stem from some immutable human nature, but represents a specific response to material and historical conditions that reproduce the inhabitants, the social relations, the ideas, and the social form of daily life. Similarities were blurred by the fact that proponents of wage labor won the American Civil War, in which they competed for legitimacy with defenders of chattel slavery. Both presented an overpositive assessment of their system, while denigrating the opponent. According to American anarcho-syndicalist philosopher Noam Chomsky, the similarities between chattel and wage slavery were noticed by the workers themselves. He noted that the 19th century Lowell mill girls, who, without any reported knowledge of European Marxism or anarchism, condemned the degradation and subordination of the newly emerging industrial system, and the new spirit of the age, gain wealth, forgetting all but self, maintaining that those who work in the mills should own them. They expressed their concerns in a protest song during their 1836 strike. "Oh, isn't it a pity, such a pretty girl as I should be sent to the factory to pine away and die? Oh, I cannot be a slave, I will not be a slave, for I'm so fond of liberty, that I cannot be a slave." Defenses of wage labor and chattel slavery in the literature have linked the subjection of man to man with the subjection of man to nature, arguing that hierarchy in a social system's particular relations of production represent human nature and are no more coercive than the reality of life itself. According to this narrative, any well-intentioned attempt to fundamentally change the status quo is naively utopian and will result in more oppressive conditions. Bosses in both of these long-lasting systems argued that their system created a lot of wealth and prosperity. Both did, in some sense, create jobs, and their investment entailed risk. For example, slave owners might have risked losing money by buying expensive slaves who later became ill or died, or might have used those slaves to make products that didn't sell well on the market. Marginally, both chattel and wage slaves may become bosses, sometimes by working hard. It may be the rags to riches story which occasionally occurs in capitalism, or the slave to master story that occurred in places like colonial Brazil, where slaves could buy their own freedom and become business owners, self-employed, or slave owners themselves. social mobility, or the hard work and risk that it may entail, are thus not considered to be a redeeming factor by critics of the concept of wage slavery. Anthropologist David Graeber has noted that, historically, the first wage labor contracts we know about, whether in ancient Greece or Rome, or in the Malay or Swahili city-states in the Indian Ocean, were in fact contracts for the rental of chattel slaves. Such arrangements, according to Graeber, were quite common in New World slavery as well, whether in the United States or Brazil. C.L.R. James argued that most of the techniques of human organization employed on factory workers during the Industrial Revolution were first developed on slave plantations. Decline in use of term. The usage of the term wage slavery shifted to wage work at the end of the 19th century, as groups like the Knights of Labor and American Federation of Labor shifted to a more reformist trade union ideology instead of workers' self-management. Much of the decline was caused by the rapid increase in manufacturing after the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent dominance of wage labor as a result. Another factor was immigration and demographic changes that led to ethnic tension between the workers. As Hallgrams, Detier and Benoit point out, increased centralization of production, declining wages, and expanding labor pool, intensifying competition, and loss of competence and independence experienced by skilled labor, meant that a critique that referred to all wage work as slavery and avoided demands for wage concessions in favor of supporting the creation of the producerist republic was far less compelling than one that identified the specific conditions of slavery as low wages, treatment in various economic systems. Some anti-capitalist thinkers claim that the elite maintain wage slavery in a divided working class through their influence over the media and entertainment industry, educational institutions, unjust laws, nationalist and corporate propaganda, pressures and incentives to internalize values serviceable to the power structure, state violence, fear of unemployment, and a historical legacy of exploitation and profit accumulation, transfer under prior systems, which shaped the development of economic theory. Adam Smith noted that employers often conspire together to keep wages low, and have the upper hand in conflicts between workers and employers. The interest of the dealers in any particular branch of trade or manufactures is always in some respects different from, and even opposite to, that of the public. They have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public. We rarely hear, it has been said, of the combinations of masters, though frequently of those of workmen. But whoever imagines, upon this account, that masters rarely combine, is as ignorant of the world as of the subject. Masters are always and everywhere in a sort of tacit, but constant and uniform combination, not to raise the wages of labor above their actual rate. It is not, however, difficult to foresee which of the two parties must, upon all ordinary occasions, have the advantage in the dispute, and force the other into a compliance with their terms. Capitalism. The concept of wage slavery could conceivably be traced back to pre-capitalist figures like Gerard Winstanley from the radical Christian diggers movement in England, who wrote in his 1649 pamphlet, The New Law of Righteousness, that there shall be no buying or selling, no fairs nor markets, but the whole earth shall be a common treasury for every man, and there shall be none lord over others, but everyone shall be a lord of himself. Aristotle stated that the citizens must not live a mechanic or a mercantile life, nor yet must those who are to be citizens in the best state be tillers of the soil. Often paraphrased as, all paid jobs absorb and degrade the mind. Cicero wrote in 44 BC that, vulgar the means of livelihood of all hired workmen, whom we pay for mere manual labor, not for artistic skill, for in the case the very wage they receive is a pledge of their slavery. Somewhat similar criticisms have also been expressed by some proponents of liberalism, like Henry George, Silvio Gesell, and Thomas Paine, as well as the distributist school of thought within the Catholic Church. To Marx and anarchist thinkers like Bakunin and Kropotkin, wage slavery was a class condition in place due to the existence of private property in the state. This class situation rested primarily on the existence of property not intended for active use, the concentration of ownership in few hands, the lack of direct access by workers to the means of production and consumption goods, the perpetuation of a reserve army of unemployed workers, and secondarily on the waste of workers' efforts and resources on producing useless luxuries, the waste of goods so that their price may remain high, and the waste of all those who sit between the producer and consumer, taking their own shares at each stage without actually contributing to the production of goods, i.e., the middleman. Proponents of anarcho-capitalism such as John Frederick Kasanka, in contrast, believe that in the absence of restrictive statutory regulations and political cronyism, the natural pursuit of property and capital allows a positive sum enrichment of all actors. Employers and employees, as buyers and sellers of services, become peers on an equal footing. Fascism was more hostile against independent trade unions than modern economies in Europe or the United States. Fascist economic policies were widely accepted in the 1920s and 1930s, and foreign corporate investment in Italy and Germany increased after the fascist takeover. Fascism has been perceived by some notable critics, like Buenaventura Durruti, to be a last resort weapon of the privileged to ensure the maintenance of wage slavery. No government fights fascism to destroy it. When the bourgeoisie sees that power is slipping out of its hands, it brings up fascism to hold on to their privileges.